Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Douglas Week.
Hello, good evening, good afternoon. Hello, everyone joining us live on YouTube. And welcome to the second annual Douglas Week. I'm Kristen Leary, the co-founder of Douglas Week, and we're very happy that you're all here to join us for this fantastic week of events. I'm here with my wonderful colleague and friend, and my Douglas Week co-founder, Dr. Caroline Dunham Schroeder.
Yeah, hello, and thank you for joining us, everyone. Welcome to Douglas Week. We're absolutely delighted to welcome you all to this week of celebration of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass and other change makers. And really, our aim with Douglas Week is, on the one hand, to commemorate the history of Frederick Douglass and his family and other change makers, but also to discuss contemporary issues, for example, of identity or race, independence, dependence, equal rights, and that not just in the US or in Ireland, but around the world. And during this event, we'll talk about a lesser known fact, actually, about Douglass, his love for sports, boxing, fencing, and so much more. And I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, I am too. You are attending an event called Frederick Douglass in Sports, appropriately enough. And we're really looking forward to this conversation with local DC historian and, if I may, friend, John Muller. This year, in addition to virtual discussions like this one, we have in-person events in Cork, Ireland, and here in Washington, DC, where Douglass and his family moved 150 years ago in 1872, and where they lived for more than 20 years.
Yeah, and we're really thrilled that we're able to host a mix of in-person events in Washington, but also in Ireland, and these virtual events, because just events like this one, they give us the opportunity to connect with people, around the world. And if you're watching this live and you want to know more and you want to follow us and see what's going on this week, you can use and find us through the hashtag Douglas Week. So it's hashtag Douglas Week, or you can find us on our website, for example.
Yep, and we just have a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin and hand it over to John. This event will last approximately 1 hour, give or take. John, that's really up to you. If you have questions, you can submit them through our chat here on YouTube, and we'll be monitoring that chat, and we'll pass it on to John. Any of your questions will pass right on to John. We ask everyone to please be respectful of our panelists and of other questioners and audience members. For in Douglas Week, inappropriate conduct will not be tolerated. Thank you very much for your understanding.
Yeah, thank you for understanding and for being respectful, everyone. And also for your information, this event, like all events throughout Douglas Week, will be recorded. So right now we are recording, and this will be available later on YouTube. Don't forget to check out our full program. Like I mentioned, our website, www.douglasweek.org, and you can find out about all the great stuff that's coming up, including more John Muller and his great work. So very excited about that as well. And yeah, actually almost all of our events will be live streamed or on video, sort of recorded on our YouTube channel. So good job if you made it here. We're very happy to have you.
And yes, thank you very much. And yes, thanks John for all of the time you're giving to Douglas Week, both here virtually and in person with walking tours in DC. We're really excited that you've been able to spend so much time with us over the course of this week. So with that, I will hand it over to John. Thank you, John. Thanks to everyone for being here and for joining us today, and happy Douglas Week, everyone.
Happy Douglas Week.
All right, I am going to share the screen. And I think we are good to go. Can you see it?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Let me minimize this. Okay. All right, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Greetings and salutations wherever in the world you may be. I am wearing a see if I can see myself here. A historically themed sweatshirt with some old-timey football on here. I will talk about some connections that the Frederick Douglass family, specifically his grandson, Haley George Douglas, had to football at Harvard, as well as Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. So I will try to keep this to an hour, 6:05. There's a lot more material. This is kind of a condensed presentation, but nonetheless, please tweet and or make comments on the YouTube if you have any sort of questions or comments. I wrote a book on Frederick Douglass in Washington, D.C. that was published in 2012. I have proceeded to present on Douglass on the Eastern Shore, Baltimore, parts of Western Maryland, West Virginia, and have gotten into some of the specificity of Douglass's lesser known elements of his public life, such as being a conspicuous attendant or an attendee at or basically in the audience of sporting events. And so we think of Douglass as this mythical, inspirational, abolitionist, suffragist, confidant of President Lincoln, and think of him often in the context of political agitation. And so this is more of the leisure recreation side of Mr. Douglass. And I think that a fuller, more complete discussion, understanding of who Frederick Douglass was as a person, some of his family life, I think that the discussion of sports is integral and pivotal. So I won't really explain these images until we get into the presentation, which we are going to get into now. And just as a brief note, my co-collaborator, Justin McNeil, is unable to attend this presentation. For more information on Lost History Associates, please go to losthistoryusa.com. That's losthistoryusa.com. As information about some of the presentations we offer, walking tours, and other sorts of historical services. Okay. Oops. Okay. So as part of Douglass Week, we are going to learn about the lost history of Frederick Douglass in sports in the 19th century America from the groundbreaking Douglassonian historian team of myself and my co-collaborator is not here this evening. He will be on future presentations, hopefully. We're going to learn about the connections and associations of Frederick Douglass to team sports that are still played today, as well as to sports of individual competition that remain alive and well today. Sports were an integral part of the Douglass family across generations, with his children and grandchildren competing in team sports. Huddle up to hear a world premiere presentation on the lost history of Frederick Douglass and sports from baseball to boxing to football to chess and more. All right. Well, first off, those of you who are familiar with Douglass's autobiographical writings, he specifically makes an allusion to the culture on the Eastern Shore, kind of plantation culture amongst the enslaved community. And I highlight this excerpt with that in mind. I'll just kind of read from the top and skim down a little bit. Douglass is writing, "My term of service with Edward Covey expired on Christmas Day, 1834. And some of you may know that Douglass was in a physical altercation with Covey, who was a slave breaker, and Douglass had the best of him. And Douglass describes that my home for the year 1835 was already secured, my next master selected. There was always more or less excitement about the changing of hands, but determined to fight my way, I'd become somewhat reckless and cared little into whose hands I fell. The report got abroad that I was hard to whip, that I was guilty of kicking back, and that though generally a good-natured Negro, I sometimes got the devil in me. These sayings were rife in Talbot County and distinguished me among my servile brethren. Slaves would sometimes fight with each other and even die at each other's hands. There is a history and culture of enslaved peoples fighting bare knuckles within plantation communities or within the American South where there was slavery. I'm not going to get into that history, but there is a specific history of essentially how there would be a plantation fiddler, preacher, and these sorts of roles in the community. Blacksmith, there were in some ways also someone who's known as a fighter. It's kind of before the term boxer came into use, but there is a unique history that Douglas in some way is alluding to. So he talks about the days between Christmas Day and New Year's were allowed the slaves as holidays. During these days, all regular work was suspended, and there was nothing to do but keep fires and look after the stock. Fast forward, Douglas talks about what is going on. The holidays were variously spent. The sober-thinking, industrious ones would employ themselves in manufacturing, corn brooms, mats, horse collars, and baskets, and some of these were very well made. Another class spent their time in hunting possums, coons, rabbits, and other game. Those familiar with the Eastern Shore know that muskrat is actively hunted today, and there's a muskrat festival. Douglas talks specifically, says here, but the majority spent the holidays in sports, ball playing, wrestling, boxing, running, and foot races. So kind of the portfolio of summer Olympic sports. Now he's writing this in the 1830s, or he's writing this as his first autobiography in the 1840s, looking back on 1830. So I think this is very interesting that Douglas was inculcated and exposed to the culture of individual competition, team competition in sports, actually as an enslaved person. All right, who is this? This is Abraham Lincoln in 1831. He took on the town bully and bested him. And I wonder that in the meetings that Douglas and Lincoln had, somehow the subject of wrestling may have come up. This is before WWF, WWE, before Monday Night Raw. And I think this is just kind of interesting that the culture and history of wrestling is something that possibly Douglas and Mr. Lincoln could have somehow spoken about when they met. All right. Fast forward to baseball. I'm not going to read this in detail, but this covers the history of Charles Douglas. Charles Douglas and his two brothers, Lewis, Henry, Frederick Jr., all are in Washington, D.C. Immediately following the Civil War, and they secure positions, federal positions in the government. Charles Douglas was a member of a black barnstorming baseball team that was made up of government clerks, and they traveled around the DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia area, as well as upstate New York, playing other baseball teams. Some of these were black teams, some of these were white teams. The name of the team was the Washington Mutuals. The second paragraph talks about the Mutuals played the Pythians of Philadelphia on the grounds of the athletic club, losing twice. Frederick Douglass attended one of these games, which I will show a clipping in just a second. Charles Douglas played right field. And to the left here is a certificate that was given to Frederick Douglass by his son, Charles Douglas, whose signature is in the bottom right. He was the president, essentially like the owner, more so the owner than like the manager of the team. He was the one that helped to finance the team, finance the travel, finance the acquisition of the jerseys, the equipment, and helped to set up kind of their traveling schedule. And he made his father an honorary member of the baseball team. And this is originally in the possession of the Anacostia Community Museum. And for those of you who have attended a game at National Stadium in Washington, D.C., when you walk the concourse, and there is a very, very nice exhibit on the history of baseball in Washington, D.C., this certificate is included as an ode to the history of Black baseball in Washington, many generations before the Negro Leagues was kind of formed in the early 1900s. So this predates the Negro Leagues. To the right is a newspaper clipping Mutuals of Washington, a colored club, recently on a tour through the western part of the state of New York, beat the Arctic Club of Lockport, which is on the Erie Canal, and talks about they played a team in Niagara Falls, and they were going to play a team from Buffalo and Rochester. And on the bottom left of the box score of the Mutual, you can see Douglas spelled with one S. That is Charles Douglas playing right field. All right, this is a newspaper clip. Fred Douglass sees a colored game. The announcement that the Pythian of Philadelphia would play the Alert of Washington, D.C., both colored organizations on the 16th, attracted quite a concourse of spectators to the grounds of the Athletic, 17th Street and Columbus Avenue in Philadelphia. The game progressed finally until the beginning of the 5th inning when a heavy shower of rain set in, compelling the umpire to call the game. So they had basically were rained out. And says that Frederick Douglass was present and viewed the game from the reporter's stand. His son is a member of the Alert. So there were kind of several teams that Charles Douglass was involved with. And in Philadelphia, one of the members of the Pythians was this gentleman, Octavius Cato, who tragically lost his life in assassination an assassination on October 10, 1871. This was an election, a municipal election in Philadelphia, and there was violence, and Octavius Cato tragically lost his life. A statue was installed downtown by City Hall a couple years ago. I want to say 2018 maybe. And Octavius Cato was an educator. He worked at the Institute for Colored Youth, where Frederick Douglass gave beneficiary lectures for Fanny Jackson, who later became Fanny Jackson Coppin, of which Coppin State is named after, was also a teacher at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. Ebenezer Bassett, who was the first Black ambassador to Haiti, who Frederick Douglass was close with. These educators were all out of this institute in Philadelphia. So Mr. Cato was a member of this baseball team, and at one point was actually supposed to come to Washington to be the teacher of the Sumner School, but that ended up not happening. All right. So not only did Mr. Frederick Douglass attend baseball games, there were also other games that he attended in Washington, D.C. When traveling Black baseball teams would come to Washington, Douglass was known to attend games, and his attendance usually gained worthy of a note in the local newspaper. I'm not going to go into all of those games, but he attended, by my count, about half dozen baseball games. So this is an interesting recollection of this gentleman, Mr. Garnett Wilkinson. Garnett Wilkinson was the superintendent of the DC public schools, or the DC colored schools, for many decades. There's an elementary school named for him over kind of in the extended Berry Farm neighborhood. There used to be a library named for him. This is an interview that his wife gives to the Anacostia Community Museum, I believe in the early 70s. This might have been taken in the late 60s. I'll just read here. One of the few prominent Black families recorded as living in Uniontown were the Wilkinsons. Miss Garnett C. Wilkinson, the widow of an early Black school administrator, recalls her husband describing Frederick Douglass and his estate. Quote, "My husband's family lived on the street which the Douglass home fronts, which is W Street. It used to be Jefferson Street, and Douglass would play baseball with the children. Mr. Wilkinson was a clerk in the pension office and very political, and he and Mr. Douglass would argue about current events." Now, there's a little bit of this, I believe they're actually talking about his father, as opposed to Mr. Wilkinson, because Mr. Wilkinson was a child or a teenager in the 1880s, early 1890s, and he used to come over and hang out, play with Frederick Douglass's grandchildren, and they would play baseball on the grounds of Cedar Hill. And by this oral history account, Mr. Douglass would come out and maybe play a game of pepper or have a catch with them, which I think is a very interesting personal look at Mr. Douglass that historians unfortunately have taken the easy way out and mythologized and waxed philosophically on Mr. Douglas, as opposed to getting to the actual nitty-gritty specificity of who he was and the day-to-day life of Mr. Douglas. Unfortunately, he has suffered from a lack of scholastic attention by everyday community, local street historians such as myself. All right, now we're going to get into boxing. Now, I will also say that this is the first time that this history has been presented. Kristen and others with the Douglas Week celebration have encouraged me to participate and help out where I can, where, when, how I can. So I thought that this would be an interesting way to demonstrate the more personalized history of Mr. Douglas and look at him in a new way. So, oops. And this presentation is being done pro bono. So for those of you who are interested in possibly having a fuller presentation, you can reach out to me. Or also, if you'd like to make a donation or contribution to Lost History Associates, please do so. It will further the work and research that we are doing. All right, so who is this gentleman? This is Aaron Hewlett Molineux, or depending on how you pronounce it, I will say Molineux. Now, Molineux, some may know, the surname Molineux was the name of a very famous bare-knuckle black fighter in America who actually traveled to Ireland. For all of our Irish friends on this presentation, you can look up Mr. Molineux. I won't give his first name. You can look that up. He was a prized bare-knuckle fighter in America who traveled to Ireland, Scotland, England in the early 1800s. This gentleman, Aaron Molineux Hewlett, Aaron Molineux Hewlett, I apologize if I misspoke earlier. He was the father-in-law to Frederick Douglass Jr. Aaron Molineux Hewlett was the gymnastics teacher at Harvard University. Harvard University had an integrated student body. As early as the 1860s, Richard Theodore Greener was the first Black graduate of Harvard, very close to Frederick Douglass, as well as the Douglass sons. And Mr. Hewlett's daughter married Frederick Douglass Jr. She was a teacher in the DC public schools, and he was essentially the gymnastics or physical education instructor at Harvard. To the left, you'll see him with some boxing gloves, put up your dukes. To the right, he is more so in kind of his office. You'll see boxing gloves on the table. You'll see kind of a dumbbell, a medicine ball, and there's some other sort of weights that almost look like big bowling pins. I'm not really exactly sure what those are. But so Mr. Douglas possibly picked up some of his daily physical routine from this gentleman, because some of you know that Mr. Douglas would have essentially gymnastic rings suspended from the front of Cedar Hill. There's an account by one of his granddaughters that Douglas would do pull-ups every morning. There are also small dumbbells in Frederick Douglass's room in Cedar Hill. It is possibly that this gentleman, Aaron Molineux Hewlett, who was father-in-law to Frederick Douglass Jr., possibly shared with Mr. Frederick Douglass Sr. some of his physical regiment. And this is just another element of the lost history of Frederick Douglass in sports in 19th century America. And Mr. Hewlett was, by many accounts, a prized fighter in Brooklyn, New York, and other areas of New York City before the Civil War. All right. To the left, we see T. Thomas Fortune, born 1856 in Florida. Mr. Fortune attended Howard University. He became a newspaper man. He was a very radical fellow. Hold on one second, please. Okay, we're back. Okay, so in 1892, T. Thomas Fortune visits Cedar Hill. Cedar Hill is pictured in the top middle. The New York Age, which was the newspaper that T. Thomas Fortune founded. He was the publisher, the editor. He visits Mr. Douglas in 1892 and writes a profile in which he visits Mr. Douglas in his library and specifically mentions some of Douglas's favorite authors and kind of looks at the culture of Mr. Douglas. And Frederick Douglass specifically made mention of the gentleman to your right, Peter Jackson. Okay, Peter Jackson was a Afro-Australian pugilist. There was actually a boxer out of Baltimore named Peter Jackson, but this is the gentleman from Australia. As you can see, he's dressed very nicely. All right. When Mr. Fortune visits Mr. Douglas, he is here in his library. You'll see this historic photo to the left, and to the right is a contemporary photo. So Mr. Douglas provided the noted Black American journalist and editor T. Thomas Fortune a tour of his Cedar Hill Library in 1892. Frederick Douglass's wry sense of humor and knowledge of the sporting world was on full display. "Don't forget Peter's picture," exclaimed Mr. Douglas. "Which Peter?" I asked, I being T. Thomas Fortune. "Why, Peter Jackson, of course," said Mr. Douglas, admiringly gazing upon the massive proportions of the Afro-Australian pugilist. Mr. Douglas said, "I consider him one of the best missionaries abroad." Basically making the joke that as he succeeds in the sporting world, he is succeeding in breaking new ground for Black folks. Not only were Black folks' accomplishments in the field of medicine, law, politics, business important to Mr. Douglas, but also their achievements in the sporting world. Known as the Black Prince, Jackson, the Australian heavyweight champion, gained notoriety in the United States for portraying the character of Uncle Tom in theatrical productions of Uncle Tom's Cabin and for world heavyweight champion John L. Sullivan's refusal to fight him. In May 1891, Jackson fought James C. Corbett to a draw after 61 rounds. Corbett would go on to defeat Sullivan in September 1892. Jackson is recognized as one of the greatest boxers of the 19th century. So Peter Jackson, for those of you who know your boxing history, he predates Jack Johnson by several decades. Jack Johnson, I believe, became champion in like 1909, the early 1900s. So Peter Jackson predates Jack Johnson. All right. Here is a photo to the left of Peter Jackson. I don't know how tall he was. He looks to be a tall fellow, but he also was someone who was very dignified, hence the nickname the Black Prince. And for those of you who are historians of the boxing world, I'm sure you know more about Mr. Peter Jackson than I do. He had tragically actually lived a fairly short life. All right, now we're going to get into the sport of chess. Chess, ladies and gentlemen. Chess is recognized as a sport, so therefore we will recognize it as a sport in this presentation. Now, Theophilus Augustus Thompson was born enslaved in Frederick County on the eastern edge of Maryland's western panhandle. Theophilus Augustus Thompson is recognized as one of the earliest documented Black American chess experts. Following emancipation, he reportedly lived in Carroll County before returning to Frederick County. In April 1872, Thompson witnessed the game for the first time in a match between John Hanshaw and another man. Hanshaw, who was the publisher of the Maryland Chess Review, gave Thompson a chessboard and some chess problems to solve. Thompson showed an immediate ability to learn the game and master its rules. In 1873, he published chess problems either to play and mate or to compel self-mate in 4 moves, and that being checkmate. Thompson was a frequent contributor to chess-related magazines. Thompson attended the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in the summer of 1876, where records indicate he met Frederick Douglass. In April 1879, United States Marshal Frederick Douglass visited Frederick City. It is possible Thompson attended Douglas's address and or in some way connected with Mr. Douglass during his visit to Frederick. Thompson was a teacher within Frederick County's colored school system and had connections with several notable men of his era, including Dr. Lewis Henry Steiner, who was on stage with Frederick Douglass in April 1879 and was the founding librarian of the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore City. At just 25 years old, Thompson succumbed to consumption, known today as tuberculosis. It is possible the Douglass grandchildren played chess due to the influence and historicity of Mr. Thompson. It's very possible that Frederick Douglass, in teaching the game of chess to his grandchildren, referenced Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson was also politically, I don't know how politically active or involved he was, but he registered to vote in Frederick City. Mary Mannix at the Maryland room of the Frederick County Public Library has a copy of the old-timey voter registration records, and Mr. Theophilus Augustus Thompson is in there as a registered voter. All right. There's an interesting history of chess in Washington. There was a movie. I got that messed up. The Life of a King by Cuba Gooding Jr. He played Eugene Brown, who Eugene Brown is a notable chess educator in Washington, D.C. He lives over in the Northeast area, Deanwood, and the picture to the bottom right is his house. DuPont Circle is also a location during the summer where there's a lot of kind of street chess or just community chess being played. All right. This is a notification from an 1881 newspaper about the death of a noted chess player. We were pained to learn of the death of Theophilus Augustus Thompson, who died at his residence on I Street in Frederick. He was only 25 years old. Mr. Thompson was a young man of considerable prominence among the chess players of this country and Europe. During the centennial at Philadelphia, he was brought in contact with most of the champion chess players, and in games at the Philadelphia Clubhouse showed his ability as a player. For several years, he taught school in Frederick City. He was a good mathematician and a young man highly respected by all who had the pleasure of his acquaintance. His funeral took place from his late residence on Monday, and he was buried at a cemetery in Frederick City. All right, now it's going a little bit in reverse order. Dr. James McCune Smith. Dr. James McCune Smith. There are some historians who say that Dr. Smith was one of Frederick Douglass's best friends. They had a very close friendship. Tragically, though, Dr. Smith died at yet a young man. He died in 1865. I have focused primarily on Frederick Douglass, essentially his last 30 years of his life when he's in Washington, D.C. So I haven't really gotten too much into Dr. Smith, but very interestingly enough, in 1859, Dr. Smith wrote a pretty long piece about chess for the Anglo-African magazine. And he talks about his experiences with the egalitarian nature of chess. And in the essay, he says that when he talks about chess, the immortal game, painted as played on the inside of the tomb of an Egyptian 3,000 years before Christ, but who can paint it as played at some rooms at Broadway in New York City in the year of 1857. So it is quite possible, dare I speculate, that Dr. Smith and Mr. Douglass may have played a game of chess themselves and or discussed the intricacies of the game of chess. All right. Now, as I've told Kristen, I'm not going to give you everything because I'm doing this presentation pro bono. And there's a lot of people that get paid to go on flights and honorariums and hotel visits and everything. And I am out here on the bus and the metro. So that said, there are accounts of Frederick Douglass when he travels in Europe of playing chess. I am not going to divulge those details tonight, but this is a print from a European cafe where gentlemen are huddled around playing chess. And there are accounts of Frederick Douglass participating in chess games in Europe. So the sporting life of Mr. Douglass included chess. All right, now we're into football. Now this is attributed to Storr College, which was a historically Black college university in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, of which Frederick Douglass was on the board, as well as other prominent gentlemen, including William Still, John Wesley Cromwell. But I believe this is probably Lincoln University out of Westchester or Chester, Pennsylvania, because it says LU, which I presume is going to be Lincoln University, but I'm not exactly sure. But this photo comes from the West Virginia Regional History Center. Now, why am I mentioning football? Because the first, I got my little football shirt on here. The first collegiate football game is played in 1869 between Rutgers and Princeton. It was obviously played in New Jersey. It was actually, there's accounts of a variation of football being played by Civil War troops in their encampment life in the 1860s. I don't know the whole genesis or history of football, but by the late 1860s, it is well enough organized and known sports with formal rules that a collegiate game is being played. 1869 is also the year credited as being essentially the first time that baseball was professionalized. The Red Stockings team out of Cincinnati was formed in 1869. This is a photograph of Storr College playing on the field, which is today on the grounds of Harpers Ferry National Historic Park. To the left is Fillmore Street. This field is still there today. There is no historical marker or no signage that designates its historical significance or its psychogeography as the location of a football field. The first Black collegiate football game is played in 1892 between Biddle College and Livingston College. Frederick Douglass had connections to these institutions. Not to reveal my hand too closely, but I believe it is possible that Frederick Douglass would have witnessed a football game and or he knew Black college football players. Some of you may know that there were universities that had Black college football, predominantly white universities that had Black football players during Frederick Douglass's life. For example, Bowdoin College in Maine had Black football players during Frederick Douglass's life. The University of Michigan had a starting Black fullback, 1890. Frederick Douglass was a frequent presence in Michigan, knew those involved in the University of Michigan. There's lots of history. There were Black baseball players, for example, at universities, colleges during Frederick Douglass's lifetime. So Frederick Douglass saw the integration, if you will, of collegiate sports during his life. And this is before the formal founding of like the NCAA, Division I, Division III, etc. All right, now what is the connection I will share with Frederick Douglass and football? Frederick Douglass's grandson, Haley George Douglass, Harvard class of 1905. He played football at Harvard. He was the football coach at Dunbar, formerly known as the M Street School. When Coach Haley George Douglass was essentially setting up the schedule, he was very deliberate in bringing his team to Harpers Ferry, which is where his grandfather had been on the board. His grandfather had given a very well-known address on his relationship with John Brown at the groundbreaking of Anthony Hall in 1881. I'll just read this newspaper. M Street down Store. The M Street High School football team defeated Store College at Harper's Ferry yesterday in a fast and spectacular game. Score 11-0. They have the starting positions on each side. And you'll see the umpire was Mr. Douglas of M Street. So before we had a formal NCAA rules and certain laws today, or rules of competition would restrict the coach of one of the teams being the referee. This is well before we had instant replay and challenges and other elements of the modern game. So what's very interesting is that when Coach Douglas would go out to Store College, there were accounts that he met people who knew his grandfather, and also he would attend evening receptions with people who knew his grandfather. All right, this is Mr. Haley George Douglas, who passed away in 1954. I'm sure Mr. Morris knows probably a lot more than I do about Coach Douglas. When I was younger, many years ago, I actually met or knew people or would hear from people, kind of older Black Washingtonians, who would talk about Coach Douglas. Coach Douglas was or Haley George Douglas was a longtime teacher at Dunbar and coached the football team, coached the tennis team, and had a stellar reputation in Washington, D.C. So as basically 50 years or so after he passed away, people still talk highly about him. And I want to give a brief shout out to the Honorable Mr. Duke Davis of 9th and Farragut Street Northwest, whose son, Vernon Davis, is a more modern star athlete who went to Dunbar High School before going to the University of Maryland, before starring for many years in the National Football League. So there's an interesting history of Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. and football. So from Mr. Douglas's obituary, it just says, here's an excerpt. Mr. Douglas was a government employee and medical student at Howard University before he began teaching in 1906, teaching at Dunbar. He coached football and track and was an organizer of the Washington Tennis Association, which promotes tennis tournaments among Negroes on the Atlantic coast. I do not have any information about Frederick Douglass and tennis or the history of tennis, but I'm sure Frederick Douglass would have been very proud of the tennis accomplishments of Arthur Ashe and other pioneering Black tennis players. And I'm sure Mr. Douglas would have enjoyed following the success and accomplishments of the Williams sisters. All right. All right, one of the more famous, well-known Black college football players who went on to be recognized as the first modern Black player in the National Football League was Frederick Douglass Fitzpollard. Fitzpollard was an All-American full halfback from Brown University, which is in Rhode Island. He was a pro football pioneer, the 5'9", 165-pound back who led Brown to the Rose Bowl in 1915, turned pro in 1919 when he joined the Akron Pros following Army service during World War I. In 1920, the Pros joined the newly founded American Professional Football Association, which was later renamed the National Football League. That season, with Pollard leading the charge, the Pros went undefeated 8-0-3 to win the league's first crown. As a member of the new league, Pollard immediately earned a place in pro football history as one of just 2 African Americans in the new league. In 1921, he earned another distinction, becoming the first African American head coach in NFL history when the Pros named him co-coach of the team. For those of you who know, like Bill Russell was co-coach or player coach of the Boston Celtics. Contemporary accounts indicate that Pollard, an exciting, elusive runner, was the most feared running back in the fledgling league. During his pro football career, the 2-time All-American played and sometimes coached for 4 different NFL teams, including the Pros, the Indians, the Milwaukee Badgers, the Hammond Pros, and the Providence Steamroller. Fitz also spent time in 1923 and 1924 playing for the Gilberton Catamounts, a strong independent pro team in Pennsylvania. Posthumously, in 2005, Pollard was elected to the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio. I don't know if anybody out there, I guess you really can't answer me, but if I ask the question, who is the gentleman to the right? That is Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson played football at Rutgers University in New Jersey. All right, so that leads me to essentially the conclusion of this presentation. And just to summarize, so Frederick Douglass had overlapping associations and connections with boxing, baseball, chess, football, and there are also other sports that I am just not at liberty to share right now. But Frederick Douglass was someone who was a consumer of sport life, sport culture. In 19th century America, he attended sporting events. He supported professional or kind of when sports started to become professionalized, Frederick Douglass supported Black professional athletes. His son played on a baseball team. His grandson played on a collegiate football team at Harvard and was a coach. So I think this is a very interesting thread of discussion. I want to thank Douglass Week and all the organizers, Kristen Leary, our friends in Ireland. I want to thank Ken Morris and everyone who is working to promote and advocate for a more fuller, complete discussion, recognition, and appreciation of Frederick Douglass. And also wanted to shout out the Washington Nationals because I really was very happy to know when I had a chance to attend the first game at National Stadium 2008, before I even really kind of got into the Frederick Douglass history, that they have recognized and acknowledged Frederick Douglass's history and contributions, or really the Douglass family, to Black baseball in Washington, D.C. So with no further ado, I will throw it back to the organizers. I don't know if there were any questions on YouTube or comments. And so this was a little choppy of a presentation only because I was still putting the slides together about 30 minutes ago, and I have not had the opportunity to present this in person. And this is an area of Douglass history that I've kind of independently pursued for several years now. And I think it speaks to the fuller, more complete history of who Frederick Douglass was as a man, as an individual. And also, like I said, kind of it gives an insight into his family life that that him and his children shared, kind of the ability to discuss sports, to talk about sports, to attend sports. And interestingly enough, just as a last note, during camp meetings, that Frederick Douglass was a frequent attendant or attendee at camp meetings before the Civil War and after the Civil War, that part of the culture of Methodist camp meetings was not only were there strawberries, no smoking, no drinking, but that baseball games were frequently played in and amongst attendees of these camp meetings. And I think that's another thing where it's basically baseball has historically been a part of Black American community before kind of more modern sports. And also with baseball, baseball's modern integration date is 1947 with Jackie Robinson. There are some baseball scholars that would tell that in the 1880s, there were Black players that played in what was then essentially the early precursor of the major leagues. And also, just as a note too, is so Douglass saw the integration of football, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing where the four major sports, basketball, baseball, hockey, football, that football historically was the earliest to integrate. All right, so I'll throw it back to Dr. Dunham or Kristen. I don't know if there were any questions or comments.
Thanks, John. I will start with a comment, sort of bringing it to modern day, and that is, as you, John, know, and hopefully some of our viewers know, there's a new Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge that was actually rededicated last year in Washington, spanning the Anacostia River and connecting Douglass's neighborhood in Anacostia and Southeast with Southwest neighborhood and the waterfront there. which is where Nationals Park sits, which I think is kind of a really neat connection between this kind of history you're talking about and the home at Cedar Hill. And I'll also note that a number of the Douglas family descendants who were in attendance at the bridge opening last year were also able to attend a Nationals game at the same day, actually, as the bridge opening. Also, kind of a nice connecting story. But I did have a comment that's kind of a question as well, and that is particularly interested in your mention of Douglas and the amusing story about Douglas talking about Peter Jackson being a missionary. And you mentioned in your comments, he talked about the egalitarian nature of chess. We know that Douglas was a master marketer, the most photographed person in the 19th century, social media guru before there was social media. Do you know of, or are there any other, or do you have an opinion on any other instances where Douglas talked about the importance of representation, particularly Black representation in sports, or these types of activities as sort of advancing the causes that he fought for his entire life?
That is a great question, and I will just very quickly answer. I am not aware, I don't have notes in front of me right now that can kind of further amplify or edify what Douglas says to T. Thomas Fortune regarding the importance of Peter Jackson kind of fighting with his fists. I think that Douglas was someone who I don't want to use any sort of buzzwords of silos, compartmentalize all this stuff. But Douglas, I think the accomplishments of Black Americans as a community, as individuals within different fields of endeavors, education, law, medicine, business, politics, that sports are part of that ecosystem. That's sporting. The sports are an interesting way where, as Rasheed Wallace used to say, the ball don't lie. In terms of basically, if someone can throw a fastball, you can hit a fastball. The baseball and the bat does not care the ethnicity, race, whoever is holding or throwing the baseball or the bat, sort of thing. So I can get back to you. Maybe I see a friend just said, "Be careful with the us." I am trying to be very careful with what I'm saying. So this is the first time I presented on this, so it is a little rough around the edges. But I would be interested personally to find out. I believe Douglas had direct correspondence with, he had direct correspondence with certain athletes and/or had some comments about sports. I haven't had the time to fully investigate that. I do think that Douglas is someone that would have, just as he opposed discrimination in public accommodations, he opposed discrimination in education. If there was discrimination on the athletic field, Douglas, I think, would have said, if you give Black Americans the opportunity to compete, they will demonstrate that they have the same athletic ability as anyone else, and maybe could say, if Black folks get the opportunity to play sports, as we can see with like Peter Jackson, who's demonstrated an ability to beat the white heavyweight, but the white heavyweight won't fight him. So part of Douglas's critique of society, I think, would have included making observations about sports. So that's a long, indirect, incomplete answer to your question.
No, it's helpful, and I should have mentioned too that you talked about Arthur Ashe and you talked about the Williams sisters, and I think that was part of that answer as well. That yes, it would have been it would have been a part of his dialogue. Yeah, so
Yeah.
thanks for that.
Yeah, I have a question, John, for you, if you don't mind as well. I was just thinking while you guys were talking there, John, I'm thinking about Douglas's legacy in sport. I'm thinking, for example, about Colin Kaepernick and his kneeling down during the national anthem. I'm thinking about, the continued, or very frequent NFL scandals. I'm thinking about the continued fight for rights for female athletes. And I'm wondering, can sports somehow kind of create a transformative change or sort of a resistance to these hegemonic structures in sport? And I mean, do you have an opinion on, like, you know a lot about Douglas, and do you have an opinion on what Douglas would say about all of these issues in sports today that athletes are facing?
That is a wonderful question, and a couple of things that come to mind is, and this is kind of answering both your question and it's kind of a continuation of my discursive rant to Kristen, is I think that as demonstrated where, for example, Frederick Douglass knew railroad executives, and I've evidence that Douglas would advocate to railroad executives to employ Black workers and or to have a non-discriminatory policy on their railroads, for example, like that ran through parts of the former Confederacy. So I believe that if Douglas had the opportunity to speak to, let's say, like a Roger Goodell about the current discussion about the lack of opportunity or the lack of basically the majority of the NFL are Black players and the majority of coaches are white coaches. And that is an issue, for example, like within schools and other issues where Douglas spoke out against that. I think that Douglas would have spoke out against this issue of essentially the NFL is a majority Black league, and Black players bring millions and billions of dollars to the owners, and that the owners should have coaches that more accurately reflect the players, or be given essentially the opportunity. And I want to shout out to Byron Leftwich, graduate of H.D. Woodson High School, who I believe there's some current dialogue about he may get an opportunity to be a head coach. He was the offensive coordinator for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers when Tom Brady won the Super Bowl. So with that, I think that if Douglas had access to the individual team owners, he probably would have been in their ear saying, you should maybe consider giving Coach Leftwich an opportunity. And I think that that's the way that Douglas worked within his associations and networks. There was a lot of overlap between religion, politics, media, and he used a lot of these connections to advocate for Black Americans. And so to get on the Colin Kaepernick issue, Douglas was someone who I think personally had a reverence for the Star-Spangled Banner. There are accounts of Douglas playing on his violin the Star-Spangled Banner when a reporter was essentially approaching Cedar Hill and could hear the Star-Spangled Banner being played throughout the neighborhood. So I think Douglas would probably, although he was critical of the United States, he was critical of United States imperialism in Haiti and in other areas. I think that Douglas, this is like my opinion, as well as taking into account Douglas, the way I've studied Douglas, is that I think Douglas would have been a little critical of Colin Kaepernick, because Colin Kaepernick stuff is a little basic. It's a little rudimentary. And I say that whereas Colin Kaepernick, I think what he's done is to raise awareness of some of the issues, which has taken years for Colin Kaepernick essentially to be, I guess, justified. That Douglas would have supported protest and the activism. I just think that Mr. Douglas would have maybe encouraged Mr. Kaepernick to take it, to maybe move the ball a little further downfield. For example, where Douglas in his life was involved with the movement the movement for pensions for ex-slaves. That was literally the movement was called the Movement for Pensions for Ex-Slaves. And I believe that Colin Kaepernick has spoken about that issue. I just think that Mr. Douglas probably would have wanted him to go a little further and then to try to bring this back around. Douglas, I think, also advocated for sports because Douglas had an interesting sense of humor where he would say, okay, let's say if Black athletes are given the opportunity to play, and let's say someone maybe had prejudices, that their prejudices would have had a reality check if they have Black athletes succeeding and playing for their team. Because basically, I mean, I can't imagine that the joke that Douglas might have said, but basically that, you know, these folks that are racist against my folks or whatever, at least on Sunday or game day, they'll cheer for Black athletes. So maybe then that will change their outlook, something like that. Like, for example, Shirley Povich made a commentary about the former Washington football team. Back then, they were known as the Washington Redskins. They were the last national football team to integrate. And so Shirley Povich was a columnist and talked about how Jim Brown had integrated the end zone when they played the Washington football team, and basically how Mr. Marshall wouldn't have Black members on his team, but basically Black members of the other team helped to beat his team. So I think that, I don't know if that's a concise answer, but I think these are all wonderful questions. And I just get it. Sometimes it's a little difficult to speculate or make commentary about how Douglas would have viewed modern affairs and discussions, because he did have sometimes very complicated, nuanced positions. And also with Kristen, if you can make this happen, I think there should be a Frederick Douglass Day at National Stadium. Ken can throw out the what's it called, opening pitch, first pitch, and my friend Justin McNeil and his family can sit up front behind the home plate, and his sons can have national jersey. And I think that the Learners have been great stewards for baseball in Washington, D.C., and I think that that sort of historicity is very appropriate. And the Nationals have done, they have a baseball like clinic and community center actually east of the river. It's kind of on the other side of, it's in Ward 7. So yeah, I think that these sort of connections and conversations are wonderful to have and show and demonstrate that Frederick Douglass's life touched there's so many different fields, including athletic fields.
I agree with that. I like that suggestion with the Nationals. Let's talk about that offline. Let's also talk offline. I would respectfully disagree with some of the things you said about Colin Kaepernick, but you've expressed that this is and Douglas's reaction. I would just suggest that he might be more critical of the ownership structure and other structures in place that kept Kaepernick out of the game after his protest.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
But that's, yeah, I mean, further, and I think you reflected that in the way you answered that question in full. So, but we appreciate that. Well, first of all, appreciate that these are your opinions and you're right. I mean, these questions we're asking you to speculate a little bit about what Douglas may have said or thought about modern issues. And then also, I'll just say, I also appreciate tremendously, and I've seen it on some of the emails we shared together, the relentless research you do on these not small issues that sort of give us a much fuller picture of Douglas and his family life, and put more granular detail into the person that we honor through Douglas Week. So really appreciate you and Mr. McNeil's work ongoing for activities like sports and places that he visited and how he got to speak at Harper's Ferry, and those sorts of things are really, really interesting. So really appreciate all that you do. And again, we really appreciate that you're willing to spend so much time with us during Douglas Week, and hopefully beyond as we work on a Nationals Park event and other things. And I'll just mention, I don't know, Caroline, if there are any other questions in the chat. Seeing none, I will just say this is the final event of Douglas Week Day 1. We're really looking forward to the remaining days we have together. I would point viewers interested in this conversation to Tuesday, the 15th. We'll have a conversation with representatives from local sports organizations in DC. And to me, it's a very natural continuation of this conversation and sort of sliding into what we've been talking about with these questions as well. That's Tuesday, I believe, at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, and representatives from a local boxing club and some soccer and community foundation organizations will be joining us for a conversation about representation and equality in sports. And I think some of the themes that you touched on throughout this presentation, John, certainly as we've been talking afterwards as well. So really appreciate your time, really appreciate your research, and look forward to talking more.
I agree. Thank you so much, John Muller, for this last event on day 1 on Douglas Week Day 1. So thank you so much, John, and thank you everyone for